let me quickly bring you up to speed, and maybe Tuanan and Luca, you can also help me. So far, what we have done is we have shared how the 5 disciplines were uncovered. How did that happen? So that was the first. So when you go back to the videos, you will see that process of what allowed Peter and his team to be able to single out these 5 as disciplines of a learning organization. Okay, so that's the first part that we did. Then the second parts we went into included, all right, so we see these 5 disciplines. Now, how do they work together? And I love to use Robert Fritz's structure, what we call the structural tension model, as a way of helping us appreciate the way the 5 disciplines work together. So let me go back to share screen just to quickly sort of bring in. So I'm not able to go much into how it works, but I'd like you to go through the videos. But I'll be happy on a separate occasion to find more time to help you catch up with your questions on these areas. So let me do that. So the way the 5 disciplines work together, here's how I pair it with the structural tension model. Essentially, Robert Fritz's work around personal mastery talks about change happens when we are clear where we are and we're clear where we want to be. And so the way I map the 5 disciplines, systems thinking, it's about clarifying where we are. Of course, the disciplines of mental model and team learning, they are practices that help generate conversations that allows that deepening or that ability to see causal relationship at particularly current reality and even at future reality. And so that's where shared vision, personal mastery comes in clarifying our future reality. So this is a very quick way of saying how I relate or how I've sort of structured the way the 5 disciplines work together. Okay. So if any time organizations are having discussions about their current reality or they're having discussions about their future reality, this is where we use this as a guide. How do you structure your thinking around them? Okay. The last few sessions we started going into systems thinking. We looked at the definition of systems thinking. Very quickly for you, I'm sure you're familiar with this. This is words taken off from Senge's The 5th Discipline. That's the definition that I use in seeing and understanding patterns, looking beyond events to deeper structures that control events. If you have come across this, I mean, that's exactly the definition that we use. And of course, in that session, we take some time to break down these words, look at their meaning, and then look at examples of what that looks like. Okay. Remind me, Tuanan, where did I stop in the last session? Did I say there were 2 types of circles of causality? Is that where we stopped?
Yeah. So we talk about reinforcing and also balancing loop.
Reinforcing loop, balancing loop. Then I assigned a homework that says, come back with examples of reinforcing loop and balancing loop. Is that where we left off the last time?
Yes.
Okay. I will bring back the homework a little bit later, okay, so that we warm ourselves up into the session. And then today, we were going to go into another set of tools of this work. So the guide that I use for us in how we go through our program is a table that I created going through Senge's book, listed each of the tools by the disciplines. And so all the tools of systems thinking, that's what you see up here in the last column. In the the third and the fourth column are the tools and their practices for mental models and team learning. And then the first 2 columns is the ones on personal mastery and shared vision. So when I conduct a session, I basically, of course, after explaining what each discipline is and the essence of the discipline, then we take turns to understand the tools of this work. And so we started off introducing balancing reinforcing in the last session. Today, we are going into the 11 laws of complexity as a set of tools. So we're going to go back here. So this is the 11 laws of complexity. Any questions yet at this point? Very good. All right. So what are these laws about? I know, Luca, this is not the first time you're hearing this. Tuanan, I'm sure you've gone through this before, yes? The laws of complexity. It's been a while, yes. This was laws as in this context. What I love about them is sometimes when we are in a conversation, and if we are familiar with the laws, you actually hear them in the way a conversation happens. And if we hear them, and preferably if the person that we're having this conversation or the team we're having the conversation with understands these laws, they will recognize them, that unintentionally, as we were talking, we were actually describing a law. And this happens whether or not you know the laws. And here's the trick in using these laws. If we find in the conversation or in thinking about a specific issue, we see these laws is playing out in that issue, it means we are dealing with dynamic complexity. It means we are dealing with dynamic complexity as opposed to detailed complexity. And this is what Tuanan was saying. Oh, okay. You have this question? What did the arrow signify?
That was in your creative tension model. So you had team learning in the middle, and there were 2 arrows going up and 2 arrows going down. So I wanted to know, yes, what did those 2 the arrows signify? Back to Robert Fritz's
okay.
creative tension model.
Yes, beautiful. The power of Senghe's work is it's not about each discipline practiced in isolation. The power of the 5 disciplines is in the way they weave with each other, the way they interplay with each other. So the arrows were intended for us to, and I'll just quickly go back in there, as a way of recognizing that as much as you may be doing work, say, for example, I think you're referring to this, aren't you?
That's the one.
That's the one. Okay. So team learning, the way I had drawn arrows coming out of team learning, going to personal mastery, shared vision, because team learning is the physical representation of our practice of mental models. Right? When we practice mental models like personal mastery, they're very much a personal discipline. They're not intended to be on public display. They're not intended for public interrogation. They may be offered to the group as by way of saying, and by way of saying that I see it this way. And sometimes in certain persons, the more they speak, it allows them to go deeper because they're listening to the way they think. They begin to realize there are areas they hadn't gone deeper to think about it. And the moment they realize there's someone listening, it gives them the permission to go deeper, to understand themselves. And that's the discipline of mental models. Of course, you have your tool, the ladder of inference, to guide you through that process. But it's still a personal experience. You may offer it in a team learning context, and that's completely voluntary. Nobody digs it out, nobody pulls it out, nobody pins them down and says, well, what exactly are you thinking? That's not a permission we have actually with the 5 disciplines. We sometimes allow ourselves to do that, but that's not a permission we have. So it's really saying in the context of team learning, as you practice personal mastery with it, we allow ourselves to build shared vision. And team learning, as we practice mentor models, because mentor models comes from our past experience and we project it into the future, they also serve as a way for us to uncover interrelationships and therefore be better able to surface causality. And these are like the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. This is my window to that reality, and someone offers their window to their reality. And sometimes you'll find that they allow us to see more of their archetype just because the pieces were coming together. So that's really where this thing, and that's how we talked about how the 5 disciplines work together, but it's also the seamlessness in which we are able to move between those disciplines that makes the 5 very powerful. Okay, but systems thinking largely is for current reality work, but there is a flip to it, which is systems thinking. We sometimes call it the doom cycle because it shows you sort of the negative, not the negative, but why things have turned bad or difficult as they are today. But there is also a positive side to that story, so that as you reinforce, as you think about how it reinforces in the reverse way, you actually help to build a shared vision. Okay, and you use that causal structure to build the shared vision as well. Is that okay? All right, you were saying something?
You. A couple of things. For me, it was personal mastery and team learning swapped around. That intuitively makes sense for me. And as I looked at it, I actually, a reinforcing loop came to me, which is the bottom 4. And shared vision as the outcome outside of the loop. Because as I hear what you were saying, it really makes sense about personal mastery enabling that conversation, and that conversation with the team enabling new mental models to come up. And then everything comes around, and then you renew your own mental model again. Yeah.
Yes. So we did this a little bit earlier on before today's session as by way of saying, don't treat the 5 as if they are separate. It's just like the palm of your hand has no power until the 5 comes together. So by themselves, they don't work individually.
Yes,
but
thank you for clarifying that.
So that's the reason for, and so I use the structured attention model too, as by way of helping us appreciate the power of them coming together is greater than the individual separate pieces. Okay, all right.
Yes.
So
what is
we're just getting back. Yes, Luca.
What is interesting among the 5 disciplines is the fact that system thinking is the only discipline that is a sort of objective way to see reality, while all the other are human disciplines. I mean, the 4 others involve personally persons, while system thinking is an observation from outside. So it's a sort of objective way to see reality. And finally, we can say another thing that from the 2 extremes, I mean, shared vision and system thinking, we can come back to the middle, to team learning, which is finally the core of the 5 disciplines. The fact that the complexity represented by the humans that work together learn something from the reality. So that is the reason why, for me, is inside, in the middle of that line, because the team has to work, because team is a complexity in terms of humanity.
So it is not meant to strap us down and say, but this is it. It was really just to say, that they don't treat them separately. Learn to see their interrelatedness and we should be able to slide between mentor models and team learning and personal mastery much more easier and not jump from one to the other. So it is really about recognizing that. But of course, the more we understand the tools, some of these things are much more easier to appreciate, to be able to see how they work as well. So as we go through these programs, it's one way we allow ourselves to understand these things as well. Okay. All right. Thank you for that question. And Luca, thank you for the share. Let's get back to the laws itself. So I was saying that when we are in a conversation and we hear these laws play out, and if we don't know these laws, the sad part of this is if we don't know these laws, we don't recognize that we actually bumped into them. But Senge highlighted this because they're much more easier and evident first before we talk about systems thinking. They usually sort of like the tip of the iceberg that we see around the issues. And so they come out much more clearly. It's like, the volcano that spews out the lava. It's the first thing that you see before, all the lava comes out. So I use this as when I'm in a conversation, or say I'm facilitating a meeting, and then as we are talking, I recognize these laws in the way that somebody describes an issue. Now, if that person knows the law with me, it's a beautiful conversation and says, did you see that? Did you see law number 4? You just described that. Now, if someone doesn't know the law, then as a facilitator, you step back and you have to do a bit more work before somebody recognizes how that's a law of dynamic complexity. But it is usually a very good starting point to go much more deeper into the work of systems thinking. Okay, so that's typically how I use these laws. One of the things that that you see these laws emerges is because something is broken, or that law we bumped into it, and somebody is very frustrated or angry, and that's when this comes out for them. So usually they're quite emotional when they describe these laws, even though they're not aware about it, but the emotion comes out much more faster. I also say that if all these laws are broken, or all these laws are there, if any one of these laws are broken, then it's likely that all of these laws are already playing themselves out. If any one of these laws are at work, then most likely all of these other laws are already at work as well. Maybe the conversations didn't identify them, okay? But we can use this to look for more deeply around those issues. Okay, so what have I said so far? These are laws that usually surface in our conversations. They are a key that we are dealing with dynamic complexity as opposed to detailed complexity. The work of systems thinking is in the space of dynamic complexity. And Hongmi, just for your reference, if I say dynamic and detailed complexity, what's the meaning for you? Do they mean the same thing for you, or do they mean different things for you?
Detailed complexity means there are lots of items, but it's just lots of details. Dynamic is the sense of interaction, and that's where the
yes, very nice.
And that's where the causal loop comes in.
Beautiful. Okay, very nice. So obviously, you understand this very well. So an example that I use is when the conflict was going on between the West and Afghanistan, and when 9/11 happened, that was a conflict that was happening there. What was the detailed complexity? Planes hitting buildings, anti-terrorism measures being set up in buildings, not just in the airports, but every buildings all over town. That was detailed complexity at play. But the complexity that was causing all those details at a dynamic level was a conflict that was going on between Afghanistan and the West. Now, as long as dynamic complexity continues, what's going to happen to detail complexity? As long as dynamic complexity continues and it's not treated, what's going to happen to detail complexity? Is that going to go away by itself?
It's going to add to the list of detail complexities.
Details. And which one is more expensive?
Sorry, expensive or extensive?
As it costs us. Which one costs us?
I think detail complexity are the ones that are obvious, so people will think it's cost us. But what adds to the detail complexity is a dynamic complexity, which is non-obvious, and people cannot. Exactly. Yeah. So by that sense, it is the costlier one.
It is the cause of it, but then we feel the expense at the detail complexity, which means if we learn to treat the dynamic complexity, what's going to happen to the costs of managing detail complexity? If we learn to treat the dynamic complexity, the cost of detail complexity goes away.
Goes down.
Goes down, isn't it? So this is a language that we also think that if organizations see that distinction, then they will begin to know that if they found themselves becoming expensive, what's that dynamic complexity at play that they need? And that's usually very cheap in identifying it, in being able to spot it and deal with it. Usually should not cost us much, right? But yet when we deal with it, detail complexity takes care of itself. And that's what brings the costs down, okay? All right, so when we are seeing these laws at play, it often means, yes, they are operating at the detail complexity and there are dynamic complexities at play for us as well, okay? So I found this a beautiful way, as not just a facilitator, as a consultant, and even as participants in a discussion. If they understand these laws, they're much more able to identify system archetypes and to understand causal relationships as well. Okay, so that's how I use this. Laws 1 to 6. Laws 1 to 6 describe the nature of dynamic complexity. Behavior, what does it look like? A lot of times, you said a little bit earlier on, dynamic complexity escapes us. We get embroiled with the detail complexity. So laws 1 to 6 allows us to step back and notice the behavior of dynamic complexity. Okay, laws 7, 8, 9, they describe where is the leverage, where is the intervention when you're dealing with a causal structure. Where is that systemic intervention? Meaning to say, as we treat the structure, we begin to heal the dynamic complexity. So 7, 8, 9 describes how that happens. 10 and 11 goes back and describe more of the nature of dynamic complexity itself, a little half-hearted, but it's again a nice way to also understand when you also develop the solutions, make sure you don't break laws 10 and 11 in the process of developing the solution. For example, look at law number 11. They say there is no blame. So the moment we apportion blame, often it makes it very difficult to apply systemic intervention. So it warns us not to do that. Okay. All right. Some of these laws, they play off each other. So when I do law number 1, I often find I can pair it with law number 11. They sort of go hand in hand with each other. So it's also a nice way for us to remember more of the laws. When I do law number 2, I often pair it with law number 9. So the harder you push, the harder the system pushes back, and you can have a cake and eat it too. It's a beautiful way of relating to each other. And the way I like to do, and you'll see also in my style, I share a lot of case studies, a lot of stories, as by way of helping us to go deeper with some of these works as well. And I love to hear what you have also done, Hong. I'm sure you've also thought a lot about this. So some of these laws you can pair off with each other. Laws numbers 3 and 4, they also play off each other as well. So you'll find as I go through the laws, while we may or may not finish all of them in this teaser sessions, but I will be doing that pairing so that you can begin to see how they play with each other. Okay. To help us through this process, I was also going to have us do a causal structure. And the name of this causal structure, the case study, is called urgent files. Let me put it in the chat very quickly. Urgent. Can you all see it? Can you all see it?
Yeah, we see the text. Yeah, your message.
You see the text. Okay. So I'm going to bring on. Obviously, I don't do this too much as I should. I want to get to the whiteboard. What am I missing here? No, that's not it. Luca, how do I get to the whiteboard? Luca is my go-to guy when I forget certain things. Where's my whiteboard?
Do you see on the bottom bar? There's an icon,
Yeah.
so-called whiteboard. I don't know if you can see. Yeah.
Okay, on my screen share, do you see it?
No. Oh, sorry. Maybe can you go to the Zoom window? Just probably you click on the Zoom. Yes. Yeah, you click on the bar, the black bar.
Is this the one? The black bar?
Yeah, let's go. Maybe let's go back again on the Zoom icon. Can you click on that?
Here?
Yeah. So
Yes,
can you see the screen?
This one?
Yeah. So can you click again? Then it show up on the right side is a black one. Can you?
My whiteboard's this one? Yeah, okay. Is that the one you're referring to? Yeah, I got it now. Okay, so I'm going to create a new one. So here's what I'd like all of us to do is to my whiteboards or whiteboards. How do I create a new one? Am I missing something? There you go. New. Okay, so on your pieces of paper, if you have a notebook and a pencil, on one side, write the text urgent files. I hope I get this to work. Okay, so I'm going to relate the story while I try to still figure out how to get a whiteboard to work. But I'm going to relate the story, and I would like us to draw the archetype. And the purpose of this archetype is so that as we go through the case studies, we are going to apply the case study to apply the laws to the case study. So on one side, write the word urgent files. And so the context of this urgent file story is that, do you know what urgent files are, Hongwei?
Where urgent files are?
Do you know what, you understand what I mean when I say urgent files?
No,
Does that
not yet.
have meaning for you? All right, so here's the context. This particular archetype was identified in the police force in Singapore.
Yeah.
And it was in our investigations department. Oh, there it is. It's loading now. It was from our investigations department. And so one of the, when I apply systems thinking, we look for what's called persistent issues, or something that keeps recurring despite our efforts to try and resolve it. And so they brought up this matter of how they find themselves again and again having to deal with files. At first, they were assigned an investigation file, and then find themselves each time being reassigned a file as urgent. All right, that's the name that I put on the chat. Now, what's an urgent file? It means whatever you're dealing with, put that aside so that you pay attention to the file that is stamped or marked as urgent. Okay, so when I asked them, so how do you deal with urgent files? They said, well, I set aside what's called my current file. Okay, so I don't know whether we can see this, but while I try to get, okay, so I've got urgent files. When it comes in, I set aside, CF means current file. Okay, you get that, all of you? So when I set aside the current file, what happens? I assign that time to take care of an urgent investigation case, because it needs to be paid attention to. So when this happens, what happens to the number of urgent cases? Initially, it looks like it drops because I set aside some other work to take care of what's urgent. So then I said, okay, so what happens to that file you set aside? Well, the time I set aside that file, if I assigned it to the urgent file, when I now come back to the current file, the deadline would have loomed sooner for me. So what do you do when the deadline looms sooner for you? Well, usually because by that time I have less time. So what do I do with time? What do I say with time? Do I have as much time or I have less time? I have less time. When I have less time, what happens? Well, I try to beat the deadline. So sometimes I compromise on the quality of the investigation so that I can submit the file to meet the deadline. So when time goes down, what happened to quality? Oh, thank you so much. Luca, are you helping me with this? Or who is doing this?
I
Thank you
was
so
trying,
much.
but I think it's yours.
All right, good. Thank you for doing that. Yes. So when I set aside my current time, the time I have available to take care of that file goes down. So what happens is my quality, I compromise on it. Now, when I compromise on the quality, what happens next? Well, while I may get it into whatever deadline that I was trying to meet, often the customer of that file I set aside, in our case, we call them the complainant, he's usually not happy. He's calling me and he's asking, so how far are you with the case? What have you done so far? Is there anything we can do to help you? I am concerned because of blah, blah, blah. So all these sorts of complaints now begin to increase against the files that were set aside. So time goes down, quality goes down, complaints go up. When complaints go up, over time, if I continue not to be happy with the service provided by the investigation officer, what does the complainant do? An unhappy complainant, what does he do? He often escalates that file to his superior, to the boss of the officer, and say, your officer is not taking care of my case. And he says, I want you to treat, and what does he say? I want you to treat this file as urgent. All right, so I have urgent files, I set aside current files. time available for current file goes down, quality goes down, complaints goes up, which means the complainant has just created the next urgent file. All right, did you all write it down somewhere?
Yeah.
You've written it down somewhere? Okay. All right. Are you still trying to create the whiteboard, Tuana?
I stop it now. It's a little bit complicated. Let me try.
Okay, no worries. It's okay. We'll just do it another time. But can you all show me what you all have on your notes? Is it similar to what I just shared with you? Those of you who've been following me?
Yes.
Could you follow me? So that's essentially what the structure or the archetype is. So what's the moral of this story? Every time I set aside a current file, it's now a file waiting to become your next urgent file. Every time I set aside a current file, it's a file waiting to become the next urgent file. So what we're going to do here is this. As we go through the laws of dynamic complexity, we're going to apply those laws onto this case study, and we're going to see how it plays out, the law plays out in the case study. And as we get to law 7, 8, and 9, we're going to look for the systemic interventions. And how do you treat that dynamic complexity so that on the ground, you're not dealt with dealing with detail complexity? What does detail complexity around a case like this look like? I need to hire more investigation officers. I need to pay for overtime because officers need more time to deal with those cases. Officers are disgruntled because there are conflicts that they're facing with their family members because life and work balance begins to be affected. So those are detail complexities that we face, morale issues. Those are details complexity that we face. But behind that was this structure at play that was causing these issues. You okay with this so far? Any questions? All right, so what archetype is this? In here, in the first loop, that's your balancing loop. Outer is a reinforcing loop. This is your classic fixes that backfire. Very nice, beautiful, very nice. Okay, so your classic fixes that backfire. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go back to screen share. Sorry about that whiteboard. I'll try and figure this out again the next time. So hopefully it'll be easier for us to manage next time. Can I get out of this? Okay, so we're going to go into laws one by one. By way of, for us, when I introduce this law, I was going to share a case study. And as we finish the case study, we're going to come back and look at this one and notice its application in the case study. I'm hoping that in the time that we have with us today, we will look at laws number 1 and 11. I may be able to start in law number 2, but we will see. Okay, so we've assigned 3 to 4 rounds for us to go through these laws as well. So we're going to start with law number 1.
Sorry,
Okay.
Sheila. Hongwei
Yes,
has posed some question on the chat.
Okay. What's the question, Hongwei? You also see shifting the burden. Instead of creating capacity, we're just shifting the burden by, yes, very nice. And if you also notice, remember I also spoke about the onion. Okay, remember I said the causal structures tend to appear in a particular order. You'll find that before fixes that fail is shifting the burden. So definitely they are close by to each other. Okay, all right. All right, so thank you for sharing that. Your archetype is very good. Your understanding of archetype is very good, so I can see that. All right, so I'm going to start with law number 1. Law number 1 says that today's problems come from, and then I like to add these words, today's problems come from nowhere else except yesterday's solution. Today's problems come from nowhere else except yesterday's solution. Yesterday it was a great solution, except with time, it becomes tomorrow's problems. Okay, today's problems come from nowhere else except yesterday's solution. Yesterday it was a great solution, except over time it becomes tomorrow's problem. So obviously, if we are mindful about this law, we want to watch how the solutions we come up with today doesn't become tomorrow's problems. So that's the other side of these laws. We want to know how to respect them and to work with them as well. All right, so does anybody remember the case study that I used in this context? Been a while for both of you. Hungry, the case study that I bring in the context of this is I grew up in Singapore. I was born in the 60s, and I pretty much watched one of our policies as they were playing itself out and how it continued to have an impact much later into our years as well. And I left the country actually close to 2008. So I've been pretty much in the country till then. One particular case study that I bring in here is you remember we had a birth plan policy that says families should stop having children after they've had two. You remember that? Okay. Now for the context for those of us from outside of Singapore, you must remember that Singapore are made up of races, different races. Traditionally, wherever they came from, whether they were Chinese or they were Indians or they were Malays, these races typically had what we call an agricultural culture. All right. In an agricultural culture or context, you are used to having and providing for many children because at the end of the day, they are also the ones who work on the farm, on the lands that you have as well. So if you have large spaces of lands and you have a farm, you want to also have the family be a part of the process. It was not uncommon that families would have lots of children. So the Chinese, the Malays, and not to say even the Indians, we didn't understand this policy of stop at 2 because we're used to having 3, 4, even 6, or even up to 10 children. Okay, so this was the context that the country found itself at the time it was gaining independence. Of course, when it was gaining independence, it looks around itself. It's just become it was, under the what we call the support of the colony. So, if the country needed money, the colony would provide for it. But when it became independent, it had to find its own resources. It had to generate its own resources. It also had to spend within its means as well. And so very much earlier on, one of the policies that came online that says, in order for us to manage our resources, in order for us to manage the population as we were, because we had to scale up on the infrastructure, we needed to make sure there were sufficient schools, hospitals, roads, housing, and so on. In order to help us do that, families needed to learn to control the children that they give birth to. Now, of course, when the policy was first implemented, they looked at each other and said, maybe it applies to you, but not necessarily me, because I'm used to having lots of children. When I get married, my mother and even my grandmother would start asking, so when is your first kid coming along? And first kid suggests there's going to be many others after that. So it was just a part of the cultural context that one has lots of children. So at first, when the policy was implemented, was it easy to implement this policy? Everybody looked around and says, maybe it applies to you, but not to me. All right. So what do you think? If you were the leader of this country, you've just instituted a policy that says stop at 2, right? And you don't see a correction happening in the population. What do you think happens next? Are you going to give up and say, well, maybe I went wrong on the policy? What do you think as a leader of the country would think about doing next? So as with many policies, you come up with the carrot or the stick. All right. So one of the carrots says, well, if you do comply with the policy, you will enjoy tax breaks. You would enjoy reliefs. You would have, you would be allowed to have more benefits compared to someone who doesn't follow those policies. All right. And so if it was coming to an issue of tax breaks and incentives, either you may decide, if you still want to have children, to say either I forgo those incentives or I pay for those taxes, but I'll still have more children. So did it work? So I tried to put the carrot and the stick. It wasn't working. Okay. So it eventually, of course, people were still producing children. So they got to a stage they had to be fairly punitive about it. At some point, they were encouraging litigation. What do you call it? Where they cut the tubes in order to prevent. So one may, be, sexually expressive, but that doesn't mean it leads to the birth of a child. All right. It got to a stage where one had to take very strong measures in order to control the population of the country. And soon enough, of course, the more we drummed at it, everywhere you go, you see policies written, plastered all over the walls, in the bus stop, in the clinics, in the public buildings. Sooner, more often than not, these things begin to rub on the population. And eventually, we started seeing a drop in the population. All right. So it drops. So let's say it was dropping from 10 per family down to 8. Have we hit 2 yet? Not yet. So will the policy just stop, or it will continue to be enforced? They say, good, now it's working. So the messages kept getting drummed into the population. Keep up with that. We are doing good. Let's continue to monitor this. And so the population starts to decline from 10 to 8 down to 6, and say, good job, keep going at it. And then guess what happens? From 6, it drops to 4, and then it drops to 2. And then what happened? Did it stop at 2? Hungry? Did it stop at 2?
Our current average is 1.1 child per family.
Mm-hmm. Now, 1.1 child per family means we can't even replace ourselves. Okay. What happened here?
The government start to push for the reverse.
Which it tried, isn't it, Hongmi? If I'm not mistaken. I mean, I remember I was still there. And then the population says, now go up to 3 because we can't even replace ourselves. So at least have 3 children. So now they reverse the policies. But then you notice it's based on numbers, 2, 3, and the population is trying to fiddle with it. But what was going on the back of the minds of the population? Because if I'm a child who grew up with many siblings around me, more often than not, more likely than not saying it applies all the time, that I'm also likely to produce more children. But then if I find myself in families where I am with fewer siblings, not as many as others, and eventually I may be down to 2 or 3 siblings, more often than not, when I produce children, am I likely to produce 6 or 8? Am I likely to produce that many? Or I find myself producing even less? Can you see what's going on there?
Yep.
We find ourselves producing even less
Even
as
less.
well. And get to a point, yes, and get to a point when if you're the only child in the family, more often than not, if I'm a girl or if I'm a boy, I didn't grow up with a gender that is different from me. Let's say it's an all-girls family. I didn't grow up with a gender who is a male in the family. And so if I don't grow up, when I do marry someone with a different gender from me, that's going to be a lot of learning that happens there. More often than not, marriages struggle. Okay, so you end up with population or segments of the population where they choose not to even get married. And if they do, have very few children. We couldn't replace ourselves. What other problems did we face? We just didn't have enough people to fill up the jobs in the economy. And we found ourselves having to also bring in immigrants, bring in persons outside the country under foreign immigration policy in order to keep the economy going. All right? Where did that problem come from? Where did that problem come from?
It came from the
You're saying yes?
70s policy of stopping at 2.
Stopping at 2. But of course, immediately it's not obvious, isn't it? Right? But then look at law number 7. What does it say? Cause and its effect are not closely related in time and space. When was the solution? 40 years ago. When did the problem surface? 40 years later. Often we don't see how distant is that problem coming from. We remember what happened yesterday. Sometimes we don't even remember what happened today. So often we don't even trace back what happened 40 years ago that have caused today's problems. But this law reminds us, but that's where today's problems come from. That in tracing back to yesterday's solution, we begin to better understand the structure that has caused today's problem. What is that structure? And in order to put a spotlight on this, I want to ask this question. Does this mean every time we come up with a solution that we have to wait 40 years before we can see there is a problem? Because sometimes that's how long it takes for the problem at a national space or a large scale space to emerge. Does that mean we'll have to wait 40 years every time we come up with a solution? How could we have understood how that solution was going to become a problem before it became one? What could we have seen or done? Because that's the nature of dynamic complexity. That's the nature of systemic solutions. They don't play out immediately. In the short run, you may see a solution, but the way it reinforces the problem usually plays out over a long period of time. And every time it does that, it's like the wheel of a bicycle. It spins much faster over time. How could we have, and this is my question to the group, how could we have understood how the problem would have played out into the future?
With not integrated data, because if you read the data analytically, not aggregate, you could see maybe earlier than expected. Because if you see just the number of population, yeah.
Yes. And then again, it's sometimes data doesn't get compiled at the speed that we want to see. We may foresee delays. But this is where I want us to go back to reinforcing and balancing loop, because there's a clue there. There's a clue there that, and just as today when we are recognizing these clues, we can actually spot how these solutions could become a problem in the future. So what was the problem that we were dealing with? Can you write the word population? Population. Write it down. Write the word population.
Yes, population can
Okay.
be a
Look at that word.
reinforcing loop. It's a natural reinforcing loop.
Beautiful. Okay. So if you look at the word population, and that's how you can recognize reinforcing loops and balancing loops, it's in the meaning of the word. If you look at the word populate, population, does it have a boundary? Look at certain races, Indians and Chinese. Does it recognize boundaries? The only boundary probably it recognizes is the earth. But look at how many races have just spread themselves across beyond their national boundaries. The nature of population, and we also talk about global population and how that would grow over time. Its inherent nature is to grow. If nobody died, if nobody died in this world, all right, what would be the numbers we're looking at today?
The population seems to grow.
It's not the 8 billion that we're talking about. We're talking about a huge number. If nobody died, that's the inherent nature. Population is not a balancing loop. Inherently, it's a reinforcing loop. It seeks to grow over time. What would its behavior look like? So if you draw the graph, you would draw something like that, won't you? That's your reinforcing. Okay. Now look at the policy. What did the policy say? Policy said, stop at 2. Which causal loop are we hearing here? Is that reinforcing?
The balancing.
All right. How do you tell it's balancing? What's the goal?
No, it's just the limits of growth.
Okay, don't worry about the archetype. What was the goal? Goal says 2. All right. Stop at 2. So somewhere, so what was happening to the original nature of this story? Population was growing. And then it had a policy that says stop at 2. So I want you to draw a line and write the word 2. Okay. And it's like, that's the goal. Okay. Now, which means, and that's why we had the carrots and stick. We had the carrots and stick around the goal 2, which means if it went beyond that, there was a carrot to discourage you, or there was a stick to discourage you. Okay. Now, when you apply a balancing loop solution to a problem that is inherently reinforcing, what happens to these two structures? The fundamental nature of population is not balancing, it's reinforcing. Listen to the word populate, it's to grow. Okay? Stop at 2, balancing. When we apply balancing up against a reinforcing structure, how does that reinforcing structure respond? What did it do? A reinforcing structure knows only to do 2 things, either reinforce positively or reinforce negatively. It doesn't know anything else. It doesn't understand stop at 2. It doesn't understand that. It's either reinforce positively or reinforce negatively. So when we applied a balancing loop to a structure that's inherently reinforcing, how did the reinforcing structure respond?
It will oscillate.
Instead of reinforcing positively, it started to reinforce
Going down.
negatively, which we are now fighting hard to reverse. But its inherent nature is, okay, we don't know what two means, but we heard you say, stop reinforcing positively. So we start reinforcing negatively. Now, if we understood reinforcing and balancing loops, do we need to wait 40 years to see that story pan out that way? Or we could have predicted this?
Yeah, we can predict.
We
For
could,
me,
because
it's
we understand the
difficult to
inherent
tell.
nature.
For me,
It
it's
is
difficult to tell
how the
because I
population.
take a look at the COVID situation, obviously a reinforcing loop because more infected, there'll be a higher risk of transmission. And then we are going to introduce quarantine or safe distancing measure, which is a balancing loop. It really depends on that strength of that balancing loop. Because in many countries, we have seen where the safe distancing is not so effective. So you have basically a trending up. It will oscillate, but it's still trending up. There are countries where they really abide by the safe distancing rule, and then you have this very level stabilizing effect. So what I can see is there definitely will be an oscillating effect, but whether it goes up or down really depends on the relative strength. In the population situation, I thought what we are missing out in the big picture really is the economy. Because as the economy goes up, cost of living goes up. That's really what prevents people from having more kids. So there's another loop there that created this effect. And right now, to be frank, that is the main loop that prevents us from having more children because it's so expensive to have more children.
Of course.
Anyway,
It's not to say. Sorry, Luca.
Yes, every environment normally produces their own antibodies when you have a reinforcing loop. Because in the COVID too, we had the production of antibodies. Humanity is a reinforcing loop that has creating their own antibodies, like for instance, wars and epidemics. Because on planet Earth, we are a sort of wait a second, sorry, an invader. And so in the nature, the antibodies are produced when something is going beyond the standard level of presence.
Well, you brought in the COVID story. We weren't in that space, but COVID has also got its own issues. I would love a separate discussion on that, but top of my mind is the bodies that had a stronger immunity by going into isolation prevented it from being able to generate the first level of defense, so to speak, in being able to build its antibodies, because they also went into isolation. So by the time it hit bodies with lower immunity, there wasn't that first level of defense allowed to build up sufficiently to protect the others. Does that make sense? So, those are where, at the end of the day, if we don't have data to that level of detail, yes, we can miss out on a few things.
But going back to the child policy from the 70s, is there a trigger point where you can see, oh, we've gone into the downward spiraling loop and that we cannot, there's a point of no return. Is it possible to spot such a point?
But there is there is an experiment made in the 60s, which is called rat utopia, or that is, for me, is one of the causes of the decline of a very rich and crowded population, because we have no anymore interest in creating a next generation, because overcrowding is something that doesn't instinctually, I guess, doesn't permit to us to authorize ourselves to have more children. It's one of our antibodies that we do not know. But we know after that experience, but nobody takes in care of.
Okay. So can you see what just happened for you, Hongli? That because we become what we call sensitive to reinforcing and balancing loop, that's a question we would ask, isn't it? So for example, if that's the trend is 2, that's where we want to go. But let's say the population numbers were at 6 and 8, right? And then we know that because we're imposing a balancing on a reinforcing loops only know how to respond 2 ways. It doesn't know how to stabilize. It reinforces positively or negatively, which means theoretically, it will hit 0 anyway, theoretically, even though we were at 8. All right. So, but if we know we're dealing with a reinforcing loop, as policymakers, what would be a question on our minds? Like what exactly Hongmi asked. Should I be looking out for when the population drops to 8, the population is dropping to 6? What else do I need to watch? I need to watch the rate at which the population is dropping, isn't it? At the speed at which that is happening. And then what should I be doing? Should I wait till 2? Should I wait till 2? 2 is too close to your 1s and your 0. All right. Where should I be alert to as to when we should lift the ban on the policy? Is it at 2?
It's impossible
We should
to
probably
state.
we should probably spot it sooner. Maybe at 5 or 4, we should start noticing it has gone down to 4. And then what should we do to the policy? Do we continue to put the flyers up there on all the walls?
Yeah.
Should we continue to have these carrots and sticks?
We periodically, around the generations, we have to trigger again the ban or lift it.
Okay, so we're gone past 11:30. So let me try and round this up. So before it hits 2 and definitely at 4 or 5, we should become alert that this is going to go to 2, but it's going to go past 2. It's not going to stay at 2. Right? It's going to go past 2, which means at this point, we need to apply what's called a deadline. Do you know what a deadline is for the policy? A line where we don't allow the policy to proceed. So be careful when you impose a policy that is a balancing loop on a structure that's inherently reinforcing, because a reinforcing loop doesn't understand how to plateau. It either reinforces positively or negatively. And we need to make sure that there are deadlines to these policies. Having said so, who should see this structure? Is it just us as the Prime Minister of the country? Who should see these structures? Who should understand that we are applying balancing on a structure that's inherently reinforcing? Who should understand this? Is it the leadership? Or does everyone need to understand what's the reinforcing loop and what's the effect of a balancing loop on a reinforcing? Let's assume everybody understood that. Do you need to apply a deadline on a policy? Or would the population know how to figure this out?
It's a shared vision, more or less.
Now you have a population that is able to understand and see the forest and not just know how to deal with the tree in front of them. today's problems come from yesterday's solution when we don't understand the underlying structure and the way we have opposed or imposed a solution that is whether it's consistent or inconsistent with the nature of that structure. And that's why we don't understand how today's problems came from yesterday's solution. So this particular law, I mean, it's so, how would I put it? I mean, there's so much behind that law, even by taking an example that allows us to understand the nature of these causal structures. But a lot of times when something goes wrong, when we see a problem come out of a discussion, and what's the first reaction that we have? We don't ask, is it a reinforcing loop, or did we apply a balancing loop on a reinforcing loop? What is the first thing we do? We look around and say, whose fault is it? Who caused this problem? Right? That's the first thing we ask. We're looking for a scapegoat or a guinea pig. And when we do that, look at law number 11. What does it say? Can you all
Nobody
see?
has to be blamed.
Law number 11 says there is no blame. When we are dealing with a systemic issue, in a causal structure, whose fault would you say it is when a domino begins to play its way around it? Because even when a domino is pushed, something has caused me to push the domino. And then again, whose fault was it? Was it one person's fault, or was it everyone's fault in not recognizing these structures? Because if we all see and understand these structures, then we can very well see together how many of these solutions can create problems for us in the future. So going back to the urgent file case study, notice how that law plays up there. Notice how, on the other hand, we didn't see law number 7, that cause and effect are not closely related in time and space, and how we instead blame someone for what is happening. I'm also curious, Hongwei, I mean, you brought up this issue about the cost of living. Again, you know, when we trace it back, you'll see lots of causal issues that we haven't yet brought out and surfaced and understood enough, because it didn't just happen out of the blue. One of the things that I've noticed in this part of the world is that when the unemployment figure tends to rise in the country, the cost of or inflation tends to go up, because now you have one breadwinner feeding 3 mouths or 6 mouths or 10 mouths. And so for him to work as much as he has to feed that many mouths, he would say, well, rather than work more, how about if I charged more? And he's not the only one thinking that way, because all of us are feeding many more mouths. We all would end up, that's the nature of the structure. It traps us into thinking in a particular way. So that's what I've seen in this part of the world. I suspect in Singapore also, with the way our housing and our costs of transport, and I think it's part of the price we're paying for growing as fast as we did, yet not knowing what it really takes, because a lot of it was spent by the government. But somebody in the end of the day has to pay a price. And we're feeling that pinch right now, isn't it? Okay, taxes need to be increased, or services need to cost more, or commerce or retailers or manufacturers end up having to pay for something, VAT or taxes or whatever. Those are the costs we end up passing down. Okay, then inherently, of course, our fear of failure, if that's been drummed up to a very significant level, the easiest way not to feel the fear is to escalate prices so that we try and draw in the income we want, so that it makes us feel good. So there are many underlying stories, and that's the speed at which we grow tends to create that, but we don't have enough conversations about them.
And there is
So that's law number 6, that play for us faster is not faster, it's slower.
I guess there are a couple of other factors that impact. For instance, we are in a society where there is a need for optimization of every participation to the economical problem. So optimization requires an investment over every single participant very high, because it must be effective. So we do not produce anymore our resources by ourselves. So more resources we produce, more we have security for our family economy. But we need to participate to an economical process that we do not control. So in this case, we need to be slim in every term. Our society, our economical society, even though humans are fat, the economy is very slim, has no any surplus. If you think about the just in time is a policy for slim economies, we do not have any fat in our economy.
Buffers.
So sorry, Luca, let me try to understand you. What you're saying is it's a self-balancing population in response to the economy. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, more or less, yes and no at the same time. I mean, you have a reinforcing loop over the investment that you make over every children, for instance, because our children today have so many resources available for them that is almost impossible to share with other kids. So this is one of the reasons why, for instance, me too had just one son. That over him, we made a lot of investments, sports, activities, travel to other countries, university, time, attention, computers, and any sort of. But at the same time, this effort is, in terms of effort, is made because the surplus, better, the intended surplus doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
But the paradox is that the not existent surplus finally becomes largely more than enough to survive. But our society is the intention of our level depends on the habit that we have seeing the reality around us.
Yes. So in a sense, Europe, if I check, Europe never had the 2 is enough policy, right? And yet your birth rate really has gone down in response to the economic requirements.
Yeah, and overcrowding of cities.
Of people,
because Italian average family, I guess, is 1.7.
Yeah.
But not 1.7 children. The number of people of Italian family, that means that we have
a lot of single parents.
We are not married. Many of us are living alone.
Yeah.
Me and my wife.
What used to be the birth rate historically?
Birth rate in Italy is falling down.
Historically, what was the birth rate? Historically.
Sorry?
Historically, what was the birth rate?
The birth rate in
Say if
Italy,
you go back to the 60s and 70s.
No, not the birth rate. The birth numbers has fallen. I guess around what was in the 50s. So we are really going down and down and down with a population that is 2 times what was in the 50s. But we do not invest better. This sort of efficiency that we want to see in our society, avoid the society to create stops, for instance, for families to care of children. because we must be effective 7 days a week.
Very nice.
And we are not permitted to stop for having children, because the children is something that is not related to a continuity.
Homie, would you go back again to the graph? Would you go back? Nice one. All right. Is 60s as far as you can go? Does it allow you to go further? I'd like us, as part of your homework, go back to the turn of the century. There you go. There you go. Nice one. Let's look at it.
Italy was famous for having very numerous families. We have an example.
That's what I was trying to get at. Yes. Can you see that? They used to have 6 children. Right? They used to have 6 children, and now it's 1 child. Wow.
We have
yes, but it's not a result of any policy. It's a natural response to the economy.
Yes, exactly.
And my suspicion is that is also what happened to Singapore. It's not a response to our 2 is enough policy. It's a nature of as economy gets better, cost of living goes up.
Well,
I remember that Red's Utopia was made with an environment that was fed with a lot of surplus of food, with every commodity, every sort of easiness. But finally, after 3 years, the colony collapsed completely. No one remained alive. No one remained alive.
Can we see this graph for Singapore? Can we see this graph for Singapore? See, what does it look like? Well, I don't disagree with you, Hongmi. That's exactly what is happening right now. But of course, what happened is also steamrolled from what triggered from the policy. But then what's happening right now, it's beyond the policy.
I guess, anyway, that there is an acceleration, because I'm a theorist of permitted thinking. I mean, till you do not have any example in front of your eyes, you maybe do not think that it's possible to make something. For instance, in a population where it is not standard to have 5 to 6 children, maybe we could have had a delay, maybe for 1 or couple of generations, before people realized that they could have less children. Just because culturally was evident that it was not possible to have less than 5 to 6 children. And so the policy of not beyond 2 could create a sort of possible thinking that before was not. So it accelerates maybe the rate of decreasing. I don't know if you understand what I mean.
As part of the homework,
I have a theory around pedophily, that the fact of speaking a lot about this can increase the number of people that remain trapped in this kind of thinking that maybe before was not present in their minds. And but the fact that people speaks about creates a condition for mind that are very near to start to think about.
Yes, that's true. Homework. I'd like for us to see, just like what Home tried to do with the population of Italy, see if you can also pull out graphs. You're welcome. Yes, and pull out graphs on the way population has behaved. Start with Singapore, but also look at your own countries as well. I'm also interested in China. You remember China has this policy, stop at 1 child. Look at those 2 countries, stop at 2 and stop at 1. See if you can pull out graphs that go back to what the numbers were and what has since happened. And when you do that, I'd like us to understand the way a balancing structure has imposed on a reinforcing structure. That's one. Now, of course, what Hongwei and then Luca has come in to talk to, don't think stop at 2 is the only thing, the only effect it had on the population was on numbers. There were many other consequences. We only talked of one because it was a policy, right? To stop the number of children in the family at 2. But the consequence of reducing those numbers down to 4, 5, 2 had a lot more ramifications in the economy than just have enough resources to build roads or hospitals. We didn't talk to those implications as yet. And therefore,
yes, there is one very
how did it come back and affect in other ways, not just in the number of children? So I gave my example about unemployment and its impact on inflation. So there are many other factors that we also need to bring into the picture as a result of some of these policies. What other effects did it trigger? Is that okay? So there's 2 homework. One is compare graphs of Singapore and China with regards to population policies on its population numbers. Number 2, what other effects other than population numbers did that policy have on the country? What other effects other than its impact on the population did that policy have on the country? So here's where I would say, like what Homi has done, just pick at graphs, look at the way behavior has behaved over time. Very nice.